Доброго вечора, good evening. Welcome to the Shevchenko Scientific Society. We are continuing our academic program, and tonight we will have a panel discussion about Ukrainian nationalism. Unfortunately, we're waiting for the one participant, Professor Alexander Motyl, who will be later. Okay, I invite Bohdan Vytvytskyi to speak. Oh, Myroslaw Shkandrij. Okay.
Well, so my job is just to welcome you to this session, this discussion, which is going to include 2 papers and then a discussion. My job now is just to introduce Bohdan Vytvytskyi, who is a lawyer, a philosopher. He's written on legal, philosophical, and historical issues. 3-4 decades ago, he wrote the first history, the first English language monograph on Slavs and Gypsies under Nazi rule, and he has followed the discussion in Ukraine and among Western scholars on nationalism. So he will give the first talk. That will be followed by my talk. By the way, I am Myroslaw Shkandrij. I am from Canada, at the University of Manitoba, but presently visiting professor at Columbia University, and I've written on nationalism as well, including a book recently published called Ukrainian Nationalism with Yale University Press. So, Bohdan, the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation is the first draft of something that hopefully will end up in a much larger project on the kinds of themes that I'll touch upon this evening. 20th century Ukrainian nationalism and historiography, political judgment, and memory politics. When it comes to Ukraine's 20th century Ukrainian liberation movement, by which I mean to include the OUN, the 3 branches into which it's split, and the UPA, there at present appears to exist a kind of paradox, perhaps even a triangular paradox. On the one hand, the Ukrainian sociological organization Rating reported in May of this year that 71% of the Ukrainians surveyed expressed a positive attitude towards the UPA, and 81% supported recognizing OUN and UPA as participants in the struggle for national independence. As Rating also reported, this percentage has doubled since 2015 and quadrupled since 2010. On the other hand, a group of scholars and researchers in the West, including perhaps most prominently Professor John Paul Himka, his colleague at the University of Alberta, David Marples, 2 persons they formerly mentored, Per Anders Rudling and Grzegorz Rosoliński-Liebe, and a number of others elsewhere, has over the last decade or 2 seemingly been on a mission to demonize this same 20th century liberation movement. They have done so, first, with an effort to produce historiography about that movement, second, with an effort to pass political and/or moral judgment on that movement, which judgment is often integrated into their historiography, and third, with an effort to pass judgment on the memory politics that relate to that movement. By a mission to demonize or vilify, I mean a mission to characterize and define that movement as fundamentally and essentially, rather than, say, partially, temporarily, or instrumentally, as fascist, racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic, totalitarian, and as a Holocaust participant. And then there is a third leg to this somewhat curious paradox. While a large majority of Ukraine's citizenry now takes a positive view of the underground liberation movement, at the same time that Western vilifiers have been producing books and articles to denigrate that movement, Ukraine 6 years ago had a Jewish prime minister, Volodymyr Hrozman. And then 3 years ago, with an electoral majority of over 70%, chose a Jewish president, Volodymyr Zelensky. And for a period in 2019, there was an overlap in tenures, and Ukraine actually had both a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. So what is one to make of all of this? Are today's Ukrainians somehow confused or misinformed about the liberation movement's goals and struggles? Or might it be that the Western vilifiers may somehow have gotten it wrong? Some of the vilifiers have piously insisted that history should be left to the experts, that is to say, to themselves, and that they are best placed both to unearth what happened in the past as well as to make judgments about it and about proper memory politics. Thus, for example, in a 2011 article, John Paul Himka approvingly cites an earlier article by a Sofia Gracheva, identified as a research assistant to the American historian Omer Bertov, who mounted an attack on Ukrainian ethnocentrism, particularly in historiography. And as Himka described it, Gracheva sought to defend her reconciliation of social engagement with scholarly objectivity by claiming that, quote, a purely scholarly motivation could coincide, not be subordinated to, but actually coincide with a certain social mission, end quote. That social mission being to revise and correct Ukrainians' distorted understanding of their own history. And she felt that only professional historians had the credentials to undertake such a corrective revision. Ukrainians have also been told that failing to properly assess the 20th century underground liberation movement would further exacerbate regional divisions within Ukraine, cause damage to relations between Ukraine on the one hand and Poland and Israel on the other hand, and undermine Ukraine's desire to integrate into the EU. To suggest some preliminary answers to the question I have posed as to the seeming paradox, it would be helpful to separately address the three issues of, first, historiography, second, making political or moral judgments, and third, passing judgment on matters of memory politics. But before I do so, a few words about just how well Western historians have accurately captured Ukrainian history might be in order. For the last 70 or so years since World War II, Western academe has largely taken the position, or pretended to take the position, that Ukrainians as a nation don't really exist. Of course, no one has ever expressed this as nakedly as Russian President Putin has, but that view was in fact expressed over and over again, as reflected by the amount of attention that Ukraine received in books and articles, by the number of courses taught about Ukraine at universities, and by the type of information about Ukraine and Ukrainians provided in the courses that did touch on Ukraine, particularly in history. But, of course, as those pesky Ukrainians have insisted on the battlefield, they rather do exist. So much of academe has spectacularly been wrong. And, just to cite another rather important example, the West's leading Sovietologists still insist that the Holodomor wasn't really the Holodomor. For example, Sheila Fitzpatrick, generally considered one of the leading Sovietologists of her era, has just this year in 2022 written that, and I quote, "The present-day Ukrainian government claims this famine, known in Ukraine as Holodomor, was the result of a conscious plan on Stalin's part to kill Ukrainians. However, the results were equally devastating in southern Russia and Kazakhstan. it seems unlikely that Stalin actually wanted to kill peasants. Rather, he wanted the state to take the greatest possible amount of grain out of the villages, consistent with its peasant producers surviving until the spring sowing. The trouble was that nobody knew what that amount was, and Stalin certainly pushed local officials to go for the maximum and refused to listen when told that the peasants had no more hidden reserves. A bizarre rhetoric about peasants acting a famine and pretending to be ruined entered Soviet discourse, and by the time Stalin was finally convinced that they were not pretending but actually dying, it was too late. Entry to the towns had to be blocked against peasants fleeing starvation in the winter of 1932-33. That's from The Shortest History of the Soviet Union by Sheila Fitzpatrick. Another leading Sovietologist, Stephen Kotkin, devoted over 1,000 pages to the middle period of Stalin's political life, namely the years 1929 to 41, in his 2017 biography on Stalin. In these 1,000 pages, the Holodomor receives about 2 pages in which Kotkin asserts that, quote, "The famine was not intentional. It resulted from Stalin's policies of forced collectivization, dekulakization, as well as the pitiless and incompetent management of the sowing and procurement campaigns, all of which put the country on knife edge, highly susceptible to drought and sudden torrential rains." End quote. And Kotkin also asserts that, quote, "There was no Ukrainian famine. The famine was Soviet." End quote. That's from Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929 to 41, by Stephen Kotkin. So these are examples, rather important examples, of what passes for leading Western academic knowledge about Ukraine. But let us turn now to the issues of historiography, political judgment, and memory politics. Undoing historiography and the Ukrainian underground movement. A discussion about historiography needs to start with a few basic methodological points. I would submit that competent political history should be centered, contextualized, and comprehensive. By centered, I mean that the subject of a historical inquiry should actually be that subject. For example, if you are writing about a political party, you need to start by trying to describe it and explain it from the standpoint and viewpoint of that party. What, if any, were its guiding goals, its guiding ideas? How did it understand its situation and challenges? What were its power dynamics in terms of internal politics and external politics? The opposite of centering would be to describe and explain that party from the outside, how it appeared to outsiders, how it affected or impacted outsiders, and so on. The point here is not that an outside perspective is not of any value or interest. The point is rather that if a political history seeks to provide a fair and accurate portrayal of a political subject, it needs to start with an internal portrayal, i.e., with a portrayal of that subject from its own standpoint and own viewpoint. A good deal of the writing about the Ukrainian liberation movement by the vilifiers is based on Jewish and Polish memoirs and Polish historiography. That is like writing a history of the birth of the Jewish state by heavy reliance on Palestinian memoirs, or writing a history of the birth of the United States with heavy reliance on Native American memoirs. This is not to suggest that such memoirs might not contain important facts and perspectives. It is simply to point out that that is not how the histories of the United States or Israel are written, or are thought that they should be written. Yet it doesn't seem to have occurred to the vilifiers that Ukrainian history needs to be approached in the same way in which the histories of other movements or nations are treated. Part of the problem is that, because of its long history of statelessness, Ukraine is just beginning to unearth, discover, and describe its own history. Some Ukrainian language History pertaining to the first half of the 20th century certainly does exist, but it has mostly been written off or ignored. Thus, for example, the 2003 volume titled Volhynia and the Cholm Region 1938 to 1947, The Polish-Ukrainian Conflict and Its Repercussions, which was edited by Myroslaw Isajewicz, and to which he also contributed a lengthy lead article, has altogether been ignored by Western historians. This despite Isajewicz having been one of the two most highly regarded among the older generation of Ukrainian historians in Western Ukraine, and despite this 20-year-old volume containing highly illuminating and informative content about Polish-Ukrainian relations. And a Ukrainian scholar who has written 2 volumes, one in 2012 and a revised and expanded version in 2019, that provide detailed analysis of OUN and UPA's activities starting in 1939 is Ivan Patrylyak. His histories are a must-read, but are rarely cited or acknowledged by most Western historians. A competent political historical inquiry must also provide relevant contextualization. What was the relevant historical context preceding the period of activity of the subject of inquiry? For example, it would be difficult to make sense of the Black Panthers' platform and rhetoric if one knew nothing about the history of racism in the United States, about our history of mob lynchings of blacks, and so on. Or it would likewise be difficult to make any sense of the US war in Iraq if one knew nothing about the 9/11 attacks upon the United States. I am not suggesting that if one knew about 9/11, that one would conclude that the war against Iraq was the product of a good, wise, or prudent decision, but simply that one could not understand how the war came to be without knowing about the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Of particular importance when providing context is the issue of power and powerlessness. How much or how little agency, status, and resources, and how wide or narrow a range of options and opportunities did a given subject of historical inquiry actually possess or lack? That issue is critical for helping us to understand not only what a subject of historical inquiry did or did not do, but also for understanding how that subject perceived or misperceived and understood or misunderstood his or her or its own range of options and opportunities. And perhaps, and another perhaps assumed methodological feature of competent historical inquiry is comprehensiveness. If one purports to write or speak about a movement whose history lasted for decades, then it won't do to just pick what happened during, say, half a decade and pretend that this half decade captures the essence of that movement. Turning our attention back to the Ukrainian liberation movement, how normal or abnormal was the context in which that movement found itself and in which it sought to operate between 1929 in today's Western Ukraine, what was then a part of the Second Polish Republic, and, say, in the diaspora in the West up to 1991. The circumstances characterizing that context varied tremendously. But if we start with the first decade of the OUN's existence, 1929 to 1939, perhaps the best way to characterize that set of circumstances is to quote Himka himself, who, in a completely different context, wrote that about Ukrainians that they were, quote, a largely peasant-based, stateless, and marginalized Ukrainian nation that had little to attract outsiders. End quote. This is how Professor Himka described interwar Ukrainians when he tried to explain why Jews did not align culturally or politically with Ukrainians, but rather did so with the stronger majorities, the more powerful majorities, that is to say, Poles in Poland and Russians in the Soviet Union, an explanation that entirely makes sense, but that also had some tragic consequences. But let's focus on what being stateless and marginalized, the condition in which the underground movement arose, developed, and operated, meant for Ukrainians. Ukrainians can be said, sociopolitically and economically, to have been cast into two deep holes. One hole consisted of their statelessness. Statelessness was a cruel curse. It meant that Ukrainians as a nation were not a proper subject of anyone's geopolitical consideration. It meant that many millions of Ukrainians could be, and in fact were, killed during numerous invasions and occupations, the intent of each being to dominate and subjugate Ukrainians and to exploit them and their territories as human, natural, and economic resources for the benefit of the colonizing state. Between 1914 and the middle of the 20th century, Ukrainian territory was invaded by over 10 different armies. The Tsarist Russian army in 1914, the Polish army in 1918 to 1919, the Russian Bolshevik army 3 times between 1918 and 1920, the so-called volunteer or White Russian army, also in 1918 to 1920, the Hungarian army in 1938, the Soviet army in 1939, the German, Hungarian, Slovak, and Romanian armies in 1941, and the Soviet Army's quote-unquote liberation in 1943 to 1944. Today, Ukrainian demographers estimate that over 15 million people inhabiting what is today's Ukraine were killed during these wars and during the Holodomor, a kind of war conducted by the Kremlin against Ukraine during peacetime. Let me repeat that. Over 15 million inhabitants of today's Ukraine were killed during the various foreign invasions and occupation. The other deep hole in which specifically Western Ukrainians living in interwar Poland found themselves was the socioeconomic hole created by a kind of national or ethnic apartheid. As the same Professor Himka has noted in a footnote, in 1939, Soviet authorities compiled a list of store owners in Lviv, and this list showed that the majority of those store owners had recognizably Jewish names. Himka also cites a 1938 Ukrainian article in a publication aimed at the peasantry that claimed that, quote, "The Poles have government offices, the Jews everything else, and we nothing," end quote. Actually, since the Polish state had a monopoly on various types of economic activity, for example, the production and sale of liquor and tobacco products, and operated various wholesale enterprises, the claim that Poles had government offices actually meant that Poles had a near exclusive monopoly on a significant portion of the economy in what is today's Western Ukraine. And Grzegorz Rosuliński-Liebe, also in a footnote, acknowledged that, for example, the incomes of Ukrainians in the interwar period were about 1/10 of those earned by Poles. Quote, "The incomes of Ukrainians with a university degree were much lower than the incomes of the predominantly Polish workers in public institutions. At a time when a Ukrainian with a degree earned 50 to 60 zlotys in an agricultural company, a teacher in a public high school earned 500 zlotys," end quote. The information in these footnotes comports with the information shared with me by my parents about the interwar period. None of my 4 uncles who had college training, 2 in what we would today call business administration, 1 in engineering, and 1 in law, could get a job in interwar Poland. Underlying all of this was a historical context in which most Ukrainians had until and I'm talking about in so-called Western Ukraine, had until 1848 been serfs to large landowning Poles. Jews had not been enserfed, and in earlier centuries had leased and managed for profit entire villages of enserfed Ukrainians, or leased specific money-making properties or businesses such as taverns. That might explain why, for example, by the time of the interwar period, Jews may have accumulated what we today call generational wealth, and Ukrainians had not. Similarly to the reason why even to this day, Black American families have but a fraction of the household wealth that white families do. The last significant contextual factor that requires recognition is that during the period in which the Ukrainian underground movement developed, Ukrainians were political orphans. There was no significant country that cared one way or the other whether or not Ukrainians were being killed by the millions during the various invasions or during the Holodomor, or whether their civil or cultural or political rights were being trampled upon. These conditions of accumulated historical disadvantage, plus what I have metaphorically called the two deep holes, the hole of statelessness and the hole of ethnic apartheid in interwar Poland, are the extraordinary circumstances in which the Ukrainian underground movement developed and operated. The challenge faced by all Ukrainians, and again I'm talking about those under interwar Poland, which challenge the underground movement chose to confront head-on, was how to move from powerlessness to power, how to move from no agency or very limited agency to agency. Any moderately competent treatment of that movement would have to take stock of all of these extraordinary circumstances and challenges, that is, the context or contexts in which Ukrainians found themselves. Yet other than in an occasional footnote, books such as, for example, Himka's Ukrainian Nationalists in the Holocaust, published a year ago, 2021, or Rossolinsky Libe's Stepan Bandera, The Life and Afterlife of the Ukrainian Nationalists, published in 2014, and the numerous articles by these two and their fellow vilifiers, strangely chose to be altogether oblivious to or ignorant about this foundational context. The writings of the vilifiers also failed the test of comprehensiveness, sometimes in ways that seem blatantly dishonest. Western vilifiers go to great lengths to try and paint the underground liberation movement as fascist, yet their campaign ignores two important considerations. First, if we are interested in a fair and accurate characterization of the movement, then we obviously have to acknowledge that the movement was aligned with Nazi Germany, but that it was directly so aligned for a comparatively brief period of its history, i.e., from 1939, beginning with the Second OUN Congress in Rome, to about 1941, when the Germans started jailing and shooting members of the OUN leadership, or at the latest to 1943, when a nascent UPA began opposing German occupation with armed actions. The OUN was established in 1929 in Vienna at its first Congress. This Congress lasted several days. We have the programmatic presentations that were prepared for that Congress. There were 14 such presentations, including presentations on the structure of a future government, on the ideological foundations of Ukrainian nationalism, on the relationship between church and state, on the organizational structure of the OUN, on industrial policy, on coastal defense, and 8 other presentations. There were no presentations on fascism. The one presentation that, for thematic reasons, might have contained something about fascism was the presentation on OUN ideology by Julian Vassian, but it does not. As Vassian presents it, Ukrainian nationalism means national liberation and the creation of an independent Ukrainian state, all rather plain vanilla for a liberation movement. And this might perhaps explain why Professor Himka and his colleagues mostly ignore the First Congress. It doesn't fit into their narrative of the fascist nature of the underground liberation movement. But if one is claiming to reveal what was essential or at the heart of the OUN, then it is dishonest to ignore what happened at the founding First Congress. But things are actually worse than that. In his 2017 article, The Bandera Cult in Ukraine and Canada, Per Anders Rudling does briefly mention the First Congress. He says nothing about any of the presentations or resolutions at the Congress, but instead lists the 4 purportedly, quote, extreme right-wing organizations, end quote, that came together to form the OUN. And among these 4, he mentions the League of Ukrainian Nationalists. Then Rudling writes that this last organization, quote, had been formed in 1925, 4 years earlier, as a merger of the Ukrainian National Association, the Union of Ukrainian Fascists, and the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine, end quote. And he then goes on to say that, quote, while there were fascists among the founders of the organizations, the OUN did not, as a rule, use the term itself, end quote. So, Rudling has nothing to say about what was actually said, presented, argued, or done at the Congress. But he does write that one of the 4 different organizations that formed the OUN had previously, in 1925, been formed from 3 other organizations, one of which called itself the Union of Ukrainian Fascists. Rudling does acknowledge that, obviously, since 1945, use of the term fascism has not been neutral, to put it mildly. But he does not say what that term meant back in the early 1920s, or more specifically, what it meant for the members of that small Ukrainian fascist organization that he references. I would remind the audience that initially the term fascism meant a bundling or unification of forces. But Rudling's mission was to insinuate that the foundation of the OUN had a fascist kernel, and Rudling accomplished that mission. Fairness, accuracy, or comprehensiveness be darned. But any purportedly comprehensive treatment or assessment of the Ukrainian liberation movement requires much more than an analysis of just the OUN's 1929 founding Congress, at which there is little evidence of any Italian or German fascist influence, and then of the late 1930s period when the influence of fascism and Nazism was indeed notable. It also requires an analysis of the ideological messaging during the period of the UPA's principal period of existence in operation in Soviet Ukraine and Communist Poland, namely from 1944 to the early 1950s. The nature of the ideological message of the UPA, as articulated in writings most prominently by Petro Poltava and graphically by Neil Khasevich, was yet again clearly and directly pure national liberation. But Professor Himka and his colleagues tend also to ignore the UPA period, as well as to ignore Poltava and Khasevich, because these don't fit into the fascism narrative, except, of course, for the UPA attacks on Poles in Volyn in 1943. Perhaps of less importance, but still worthy of note, are any views and attitudes expressed by the sizable contingent of members of the liberation movement who are incarcerated in the Gulag for decades. There is no evidence of which I am aware that any of these inmates expressed any fascist views or sentiments, as surely fellow Jewish or Russian inmates who later penned recollections about the Gulag would have noticed had there been any. Last but not least, there is the very important story of Prologue and the journal Suchasnist, funded by the United States and formed by 2 of the leading members of the leadership of the underground in Ukraine during the first Soviet and then the German occupations, namely Mykola Lebed and Myroslaw Prokop. The ideological profile of Prologue and Suchasnist was a pragmatically nationalist one. Being pragmatically nationalist meant hiring and attracting moderately liberal journal editors and allowing the journal to attract mostly moderately liberal contributors, because that was who the best Ukrainian intellectuals were then, and this meant supporting the regular appearance of a lively and highly interesting intellectual journal in the diaspora. This was really important for at least 3 different reasons. First, Suchasnist nourished and provided a venue for Ukrainian diaspora intellectual and cultural expression. This at a time of extreme marginalization of everything Ukrainian, both in the West and in Soviet Ukraine. Second, because Suchasnist and some Prologue book publications were successfully smuggled into Ukraine, they had at least a bit of influence there at a time during the Cold War when Ukraine was in fact confined behind 2 iron curtains. Third, Suchasnist's existence and quality meant that there was a worthy and therefore important Ukrainian interlocutor for the Polish journal Kultura, and for the critically important work done through that journal in advancing Polish-Ukrainian rapprochement, as led by its extraordinary editor, Jerzy Giedroyc, along with his colleagues. This Polish-Ukrainian rapprochement was also advanced by the publication in 1985 of a Polish-language edition of a specially prepared issue of Suchasnost that went through multiple runs. And Prolog did a little bit to help the Polish Solidarity movement in the 1980s. To remind ourselves, this was all done at the direction of people such as Levin and Prokop, members of the underground leadership who had earlier been jailed by the Poles and who had fought against the Poles. More broadly, all of the points that I have mentioned, starting with the 1929 Congress and continuing all of the way to the activities of Prolog in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, are part of the story of the Ukrainian underground. To state the obvious, the principal comprehensiveness requires their inclusion into any purportedly overall treatment or assessment of that movement. One other important aspect of the comprehensiveness principle is the question of to what extent were fascist or Nazi influences on the Ukrainian liberation movement in the late 1930s a matter of geopolitics, and to what extent were they a matter of ideological affinity. As Trevor Erlacher has shown, it is quite clear from his choices and behavior during World War II that for someone such as Dmytro Dontsov, the ideological affinity was at least as important as geopolitical considerations. But that is less than obvious when it came to the OUN itself. As late as 1940, in the middle of the period of OUN's closest alignment with Germany, Mykola Stiborsky, one of, if not the main OUN ideologist, wrote that had it been England, France, and the United States that were aligned against the Soviet Union, rather than Germany, Italy, and Japan, Ukrainian nationalists would have aligned with the former rather than the latter. Again, this was written in 1940, not 5 years later after the Allies had already defeated Germany. This fact deserves some careful attention. To conclude these remarks about doing historiography, it should be obvious that whatever one's sentiments about the Ukrainian liberation movement may be, if one is setting out to do historiography, one should, instead of making sanctimonious statements or insinuations about one's purported objectivity, in fact try to research, grasp, and understand that subject of historical inquiry in a manner that is centered, contextualized, and comprehensive. Historiography that fails to do so is less than valid or credible. And making political judgments about the Ukrainian underground. Anyone is entitled to make political judgments, but it is not obvious that historians are any better than others at doing so. What is fairly clear, at least to me, is that historians should do history and not take it upon themselves to try and play a behind-the-scenes role of prosecutor, judge, and jury all rolled into one. Perhaps I am old-fashioned, but I expect historians to contribute to our store of knowledge by exploring, discovering, and then recording new facts and information, as well as by trying to advance our understanding of why things happened the way they did by discovering or revealing new connections or relations or perspectives or causal factors. What historians should definitely not do is to infuse what they present as purportedly objective historiography with their own political judgments or preferences by cherry-picking some facts while ignoring others, such as, for example, by writing about the UPA's attacks on Polish civilians in 1943 in Volyn without murmuring a word about the Polish Operation Burza, or Tempest, and the Polish plan to re-establish colonial rule in Western Ukraine, and how that knowledge influenced the UPA in Volyn, or by the sneaky practice of inconsistent and prejudicial word choices. Ukrainians are often made out to seem different, extreme, or crazy. Other nations are patriotic. Ukrainians are nationalists. Other nations are set to commemorate their notable historical figures. Ukrainians are set to glorify theirs. Other nations are set to memorialize their fallen heroes. Ukrainians are set to form a cult, and so on. Just to cite one seemingly innocuous example, in his book on Bandera, Rosolinski-Liebe, within a span of 2 pages, 3 times refers to Mykola Michnowski as a purported Ukrainian nationalist extremist. But a page later, he refers to someone who was actually more extreme than Michnowski and, more importantly, had much more practical and deleterious political influence than Michnowski ever had, namely the prominent Polish far-right figure Roman Dmowski. He refers to him merely as, quote, the Polish Endecha politician Roman Dmowski, end quote. Endecha simply referring to the name of his political party in Polish. If we are to engage in political judgment, and if we are serious about striving to make it as rational and fair-minded as we can, then some basic premises need to be made clear. We should assume that, to begin with, all peoples and nations are equal, and that historically all peoples and nations had a right to consider themselves equal with other peoples and nations. A corollary to this first principle is that no nation ever had the right to impose colonial dominion and control over another. Secondly, if any people or nation had inequality imposed upon them or it, then they or it had every right to seek equality. Thus, for example, those upon whom another nation or nations sought to impose colonial domination had every right to resist that domination. In the interwar period, Ukrainians had colonial control imposed upon them by Poland and the Soviet Union. During World War II, Ukrainians were in the unenviable position of having not 1 or 2, but actually 3 different powers seeking to assert or reassert colonial dominion over them: Germany, the Soviet Union, and Poland. If the vilifiers take the racist-like position that, for some reason, Ukrainians deserved to be subordinated and they did not have the right to resist, then they should come clean and say so. Otherwise, they must admit that the underground movement deserved to exist and that it was right to seek independence for Ukraine. I suspect that this basic sense that Ukrainians had been subjugated and that the underground movement had sought to liberate Ukrainians from that subjugation is why a large majority of Ukrainians today are expressing a positive view of that movement, and why they are right and the vilifiers wrong. How any resistance was conducted was in most or all cases determined by the range of options and opportunities available to the resisting people or nations. In other words, by circumstances that the colonized did not choose or create. Most important among these circumstances is foreign support. American revolutionaries had the great good luck to receive major support from a very significant power, namely France. The Algerians in their fight for independence received significant support from the Soviet Union. The Vietnamese received major support both from the Soviet Union and China. Ukrainians received no help from anyone. So any judgment of the Ukrainian movement must from the outset also factor in that set of circumstances. Further, with respect to available choices and options, what range of choices did any Ukrainians have in the 1930s or the 1940s? The vilifiers like to extol the 1930s Ukrainian Democrats in UNDO, and I may myself have been in that camp had I been alive then. But ultimately, the UNDO Democrats did not meet the moment. They, by their own admission, did not accomplish anything in terms of gaining agency or rights for Ukrainians. And then they were completely crushed by the invading Soviets in 1939. So the vilifiers should make explicit exactly what they think that Western Ukrainians should have done in the 1930s. Submit, acquiesce, perhaps pray harder. Then in 1939, when the Soviets invaded Western Ukraine, and then in the 1940s, once the war broke out, again, what should Ukrainians have done? Become collaborators of the Soviet regime that had in the 1930s tried to destroy Ukrainians as a nation? Join the Red Army and then loot and gang rape their way all the way to Berlin? Perhaps try to keep their heads down very low, but then in 1943-44 nonetheless be impressed into the Red Army as so-called Chornosvetniki, who were then sent to attack German machine gun placements while armed with shovels and rakes. Should they have passively submitted to being deported as Ostarbeiter to Germany for slave labor? What exactly should Ukrainians have been doing then? Whereas there are overarching reasons to evaluate the underground movement positively, this should not in any way mean that individual decisions or actions of either individuals acting in the name of the movement or by the movement itself should be considered beyond criticism or reproach. It was a person whom I consider one of the underground movement's heroes, Maria Marichka Sauchen-Teskir, who herself expressed the view to me that the movement should, at the time, have publicly condemned the German genocidal campaign against the Jews, and that although Volyn could not be discussed without the historical and political context surrounding it, it was in the end wrong for the UPA to have attacked and killed Polish civilians in 1943. Perhaps most importantly, this discussion should lead us to understand that while it is possible, in light of the overall circumstances that were imposed upon Ukrainians, to reach a general conclusion about the import of the underground liberation movement, it is difficult to assert more specific praise or condemnation without specifying which period of the movement's existence one is speaking about, and also upon which segment of that movement one is focusing. The conditions under which or in which Ukrainians lived in interwar Poland were different from those prevailing under Soviet rule in 1939 to 41, which were different from those under Nazi German rule between 41 and 44, which were then different from reimposed Soviet rule after 1944, which were different from conditions in the Gulag, all of which were different from life in Western democracies in the diaspora. And even under German rule in 1941 to 44, life for Ukrainians was quite different in the German district Galicia, that was part of the so-called general government, than it was in Volyn and other parts of Ukraine that were in the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. Also different was the dynamic among Germans, Poles, and Ukrainians in Volyn than it was in the district Galicia. So different judgments about different periods and different locations and circumstances may well be in order. On the issue of memory politics, much can be said about memory politics, i.e. the question of whom countries or local administrations should choose to memorialize. But in my view, there are two issues that trump all others. First, every country and nation has the right to choose whom it wishes to memorialize, and no one on the outside has the right to try to impose his, her, its choice or choices. That is such an obvious assumption that we all accept it as a given without any further thought. Second, with very few exceptions, Stalin and Hitler being the obvious exceptions, what is and should be open to debate for anyone inside or outside a country is not so much who is memorialized, but for what. A brief consideration of the memory politics involving George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Winston Churchill may illuminate both of these issues. Washington was a racist insofar as he was an owner of many black slaves. Jefferson was likewise a racist and an owner of 600 slaves. In addition, he was a hypocrite of major proportions. He pretended that Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman with whom over a period of some 38 years he had had 6 children, which sexual relations began when Jefferson was 44 and she was 14, was not the woman with whom he had relations and with whom he had children. Furthermore, he actually argued against race mixing because, so he claimed, black people were inferior to whites in body and mind. So it's not very likely that Jefferson or Washington were viewed as heroes by their slaves, or that their slaves would have mounted any monuments to them. But at least Washington freed his slaves upon his death. Jefferson did not even Sally Hemings. Winston Churchill was a proud and unreconstructed imperialist and a racist, and his policy choices and decisions as the unquestionably heroic Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II nevertheless caused the deaths in Bengal of several million Indians due to starvation. India was, of course, a colony of Britain then. Nonetheless, I think it fair to say that if some academic or researcher from Canada or Germany or Poland were to come to the United States or Great Britain and in all sincerity advise respectively us Americans or the British to take down our monuments and statues to Washington, Jefferson, or Churchill, I think we all know what their response would be. It would be laughter, and if the academic still pressed his or her advice, he or she would be told to go fly a kite or something perhaps less diplomatic. But that expected outcome is already baked into the cake of expectations, which is why no one, whether from Canada or Germany or wherever, has attempted or is likely to try and attempt to tell us or the British whom we should commemorate. When today's Ukrainians want to commemorate the Ukrainian underground, why do they want to honor it? For its mistakes or the mistakes of its members, or for exhibiting, under the most difficult of circumstances, the courage, self-sacrifice, and extraordinary dedication of many of those members to the effort to help preserve Ukrainian identity and achieve subjecthood for Ukrainians. Professor Himke and some of his colleagues, as well as some in Poland and Israel, seem to think that they are entitled to impose upon Ukrainians their definitions of how to understand the Ukrainian underground. But that would be like foreigners insisting to us Americans that by commemorating Jefferson or Washington, we are in fact endorsing racism and slavery, and therefore that we need to tear down the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial. Ukrainians have the right to decide how they view and define their own history. Obviously, neither Ukrainians nor anyone else has the right to manufacture a history, much less to try to impose that manufactured history on its neighbors or the rest of the world. And Ukrainians have the right to choose why it is, or for what actions they memorialize any given individual, movement, or organization. None of this should be controversial, but surprisingly, it often is presented as though it were. Thank you for your attention.
So our next speaker is Alexander Motyl, who needs no introduction, but he was a professor at Rutgers and is now teaching at Columbia University and is well known as a political scientist and a commentator on current events.
My apologies for being so late. I was persuaded that this event began at 6 o'clock. And then at exactly 4:59, I looked into my events planner and it said 5 p.m. Fortunately, I live 5 blocks away. So in any case, I mean, it's very hard after such a brilliant presentation to say anything very original. So let me start with a reminiscence and then proceed to make a number of points that will be somewhat different and perhaps complementary to what Dr. Vytvytskyi said. I first got involved in studying Ukrainian nationalism in college in my junior and senior years, so this is a fairly long time ago, 1974-75. And then when I lived in Vienna in 1977-78, I worked on what eventually became my first book. It was called The Turn to the Right, The Ideological Origins and Development of Ukrainian Nationalism from 1919 to 1929. That came out in 1980 or something like that, and received pretty good reviews. I remember when I was researching the book, researching the material for the book, and I was drawing primarily on original sources found in the Viennese archives, library, and places like that. I was struck by the fact that there were, well, first of all, that there was almost no serious English language, or for that matter, any kind of language literature other than Ukrainian, on the nationalist movement. There was a book by Jaron Armstrong, published in 1950-51, thereabouts, called Ukrainian Nationalism, which is still a very good book. Yaroslav Bielinsky devoted 1 or 2 chapters on that in his book on the Second Soviet Republic, Ukraine after World War II. Poles had written a number of things. As far as I recall, nothing comes to mind from the German perspective. Roman Ilnitsky wrote a 2-volume set on the Ukrainian liberation movement and Germany, but that was in German, written by a Ukrainian. Anyway, so in terms of scholarship, very little. Again, I'm sure I've missed a number of things in my recounting, but very little. There was a fair amount written in support of the movement, primarily in Ukrainian by people who supported the movement. A lot of that happened to be memoirs, which were usually very interesting. And a lot of it was hagiography, sort of heroization. And of course, the Soviets produced a fair amount of stuff, but it was generally of the propaganda, sort of unvarnished propaganda. Some of you may recall there used to be a section in the journal, I believe it was Zhovtyn, which was published, I believe, by the Lviv Writers' Union. But in any case, it was called Post imeni Yaroslava Halana. And it printed articles of various kinds denouncing the nationalists for all sorts of sins. The Ukraina Society of Tovarystvo Ukraina would always publish little brochures about the fascists in the ranks. The Werewolves in Munich, these sorts of lurid titles. It's fun to read, by the way, so if you ever have an opportunity, go for them. And it's the sort of thing that would have been published by the Ukrainian communists on 4th Street in those days. Anyway, to move to the current period, I mean, obviously the number of works on Ukraine in general and Ukrainian nationalism in particular has grown immensely. It's no longer what it was when I was writing this book. Now you can actually draw on 10, 20, 30, 40 scholarly books dealing with Ukraine, or semi-scholarly books dealing with Ukraine, a slew of articles, obviously in English, but also in German. And of course, most importantly, an enormous amount has been written by Ukrainian scholars, young and old, dealing with this. And that is, of course, the one part that was missing altogether, because the Ukrainians were disenfranchised, had no vote, and voice, and vote, and couldn't say much of anything in terms of their scholarship. Let me just jump to some of the issues that, using this as background, jump to some of the issues raised by Dr. Vytvytskyi. He talks about the vilifiers. They actually refer to themselves as revisionists. The idea being that there is a mainstream, which is presumably a nationalist, an apologetic, hagiographic, and so on, and they are the ones who are breaking the mold. This is actually one of the first, if not the first, misinterpretation that they engage in. I'll give you a bunch of others, and of course you've heard a substantive analysis of this from Dr. Vytvytskyi. In point of fact, their argumentation, their articles and books, differ in no significant way from the articles and books that were published by the Ukrainian Society and the Post imeni Yaroslava Halana. All right, it's not a scholarship, it's propaganda. Now the difference is that Soviets, well again, I'm not even sure it's a difference, because the Soviets actually used archival materials, so it wasn't as if they were making things up completely. They were making up, I don't know, a quarter, a third, 10%, 20%, but they tended to make up a certain amount. But then, of course, at the same time, there was something resembling a more or less solid reference to particular archives that, of course, were inaccessible to us, but one had to assume that there might be some kernel of truth in them. And we see the same thing in the writings of the so-called vilifiers. They obviously have done a lot of homework, but at the same time, they also engage in misrepresentations, omissions, outright lies, in order to make their point. And of course, that makes it difficult to argue against them, because 75–80% of what they're writing is more or less okay, but then it's the important 10 or 20% that one may not be able to see offhand unless you're an expert who follows these things. And of course, that sounds like Putin's propaganda as well, right? I mean, this sounds like anybody's propaganda, come to think of it. Anyway, I would say that in point of fact, the vilifiers are not revisionists, because the mainstream was Soviet propaganda. The post imeni Helena, that was the mainstream understanding of Ukrainian nationalism. They by far outnumbered what was being written in the immigration and the diaspora in terms of books and articles. I don't mean newspaper articles. So in effect, they are not revisionists, they are continuing the time-honored tradition of Soviet propaganda. All right? At the same time, I would sort of the opposite side, 180 degrees opposed to them, are the Ukrainians in the diaspora as well as in Ukraine, who are essentially apologists, all right? Who are seeking for heroes and finding heroes, and doing that in a very similar kind of manner. They too ground their analyses in facts. They've done their homework, but then there's that suspicious 10 or 20%. It just happens to be a different 10 or 20%. The real revisionists are the people who are trying to provide a balanced view in the manner that Dr. Vytvytskyi was illuminating. They're trying to suggest that things were complicated. It wasn't simply a question of a procurator making a case for the guilt of a victim and a defense attorney arguing and misquoting and misusing facts in order to argue for innocence. That's not what scholarship is about. It's supposed to be about something called the truth, whatever that is. But in any case, we know what it's not. And neither of those two extremes were engaging in genuine scholarship. It was essentially a form of propaganda. Soviet on the one side, anti-Soviet on the other side. And what the true revisionists are doing, people like Patrylyak, people like the two gentlemen sitting on the panel, they're trying to show the nationalist movement in all of its complexities. Back in the 1960s, I believe there was a short book written by Lev Rebit called Svitla I Tini OUN. And I think that's the point. The point of scholarship is to show the pluses and the minuses within a broader social, economic, and international context, make these pluses and minuses understandable and comprehensible. So rather than focusing only on the pluses or only on the minuses, we combine both into something resembling a coherent, fair, even-handed, non-apologetic, non-propaganda narrative. That's not hard to do. People do that all the time. Go to Barnes & Noble and look at the history section, and you'll find first-class histories of all sorts of periods of history. But in this particular case, it's hard to do because the topic is so politicized. Obviously on the part of the critics, but also on the part of the apologists. And it's full of minefields, it's full of all sorts of problematic issues. But the way out of this is to be even-handed. The way out of this is not to misquote, is not to misrepresent, is not to lie, but take into consideration both the pluses and the minuses, look at them in context, look at them over time, and also be attentive to comparison. Because it's never just sufficient to study anything on its own. Invariably, we missee things, right? It's always important and useful to see things in comparison to other things, to look for similarities and identities. And I'll come back to this point in a second. Anyway, let me just give you a few more examples of the really preposterous and kind of earth-shatteringly crude misrepresentations that I've encountered in studying the vilifiers, or in reading the vilifiers. I don't study them anymore. Life is too short. You may recall a number of years ago, the biography, the so-called biography of Yaroslav Stetsko, which he delivered while being imprisoned by the Nazis. And in this so-called biography, he says that he supports Nazi policies towards racism and Jews and so on. Immediately, this is expanded and drummed up as acknowledgement of the fact that he was obviously a Nazi. Clearly, how could you conclude anything else with that? Again, I have no idea. Perhaps he was, perhaps he wasn't. I'm not here to defend him. I'm here to quote to underline the misrepresentation of this quote. You do not take seriously the statements made under duress. Here's a guy who's just been arrested, who's about to be sent into a concentration camp, who has some presumed knowledge of both Soviet and Nazi methods, and who is probably, possibly, or maybe not, but possibly willing to say anything in order not to get into trouble. In other words, this document, which may or may not be authentic, but in any case, let's assume it's authentic, is proof of nothing. Now again, this isn't to say that Stetsko may or may not have had those sorts of inclinations. I don't know, and for present purposes, I don't care. But you don't use this kind of document for this kind of purpose. The most you can say is, well, he said this, but we don't know what it means. And we don't know what it means. Another example, Wendy Lauer, another Holocaust historian, again, not a Ukrainian, obviously, you can tell from the name, cites a quotation from Dmytro Dontsov, which he made in 1924 in a journal that he then edited called Zahrava. It's a quotation that I actually quoted in my book. And the quotation reads something to the following effect. The Jews are responsible for everything that transpired, for all the losses of the revolution, comma, but the major amount of responsibility and fault goes to the Moskali. All right? So everybody's at fault. She quotes, and she cites me as a source. This is the thing. She quotes the first part with a period.
Oh.
But there is no period. There is a comma, after which Dontsov says, but the true fault, the true responsibility lies with the Russians. You don't do that kind of thing. This is simply unconscionable. Another example, famous article written by John Paul Himka on the Lviv pogrom of 1941.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is a question of context, as raised by Dr. Vytvytskyi. You cannot understand the Lviv pogrom without understanding the fact that immediately before withdrawing from Lviv, and more generally Western Ukraine, the NKVD massacred somewhere between 20 and 25,000 Ukrainian political prisoners in a slew of prisons and camps. Several thousand were killed in Lviv, hundreds in many other places, but it was close to 25. Ksenia Kebuzinska and I, we actually co-edited a volume containing materials documenting this so-called West Ukrainian massacre, as we called it. This is like, again, this is like ignoring 9/11 while writing about the invasion of Iraq. Surely the massacre, and remember, this massacre takes place in a course of about 7 days, starting in Lemkiivshchina and ending with Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk. This massacre goes in several ways. At the height of summer, bodies are decaying, there is a stench in the city, people come in to these prisons, and they find their relatives mutilated before and possibly after having been killed. My mother even told me about this. She came from a small town, Przemyślane, which had 77,000 people, about 10% of whom 700 were Ukrainian. And she said as soon as the Soviets withdrew, everybody ran to the local prison, and it was shut. No one was in the cells. And then someone pointed to the fact that the ground behind the prison was soft and steaming. And they uncovered 22 corpses, one of whom happened to be an uncle of mine. And this Himka, in his article, mentions this in one sentence. This is unconscionable. You simply can't do this. You simply cannot do this kind of thing. There is talk as well, again, one finds this in a variety of articles and books, that the Ukrainian nationalists had an anti-Semitic discourse. I've read a number, I believe 2 articles on this. Now, I don't know what you think of when you hear the word discourse, but when I use the word discourse, it means a way of talking about something or other. There's a language, there's a logic, all right? And it's widespread, right? We could say that there's a Shevchenko discourse amongst Ukrainian diaspora, right? Because we're always talking about Shevchenko. These articles, when they talk about the anti-Semitic discourse, they invariably cite the same 10, maybe 15 articles and brochures written in the course of about 35 years. 10 articles or brochures written in the course of 35 years ain't no discourse. That's 10 or 15 articles written in the course of 35 years. They may reveal something about their authors. They say absolutely nothing about the so-called discourse, right? If anything, there was a discourse of nationalism in Western Ukraine. Clearly, we can agree on that. There may have been a discourse regarding some kind of attitudes of hostility towards Poles, Russians, and Jews. But to use these particular bits of evidence as evidence of an existing discourse is simply nonsensical. And no respectable historian would do that in any other field. And more important, no respectable historian in any other field would get away with it. But in this field, anything goes. As long as you press the right buttons and you say the right words, everything goes, as long as you're on the side of the angels and not the so-called devils. I'll give you one more example. This isn't so much a question of misinterpretation as of perhaps naivete. The number of Jews killed in the Lviv pogrom of July 1941. You look at this existing literature, the memoirs and so on, and the number is usually given as about 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. You know, this is serious, right? 2,000 is really serious. Of course, anybody's death in a pogrom would be serious, but 2,000 is very serious. A couple of years ago, a German scholar by the name of Kai Struve looked at the actual sources that were continually being cited and decided, or concluded rather, that many of them simply were unreliable, and he came up with the number of about 200-300. Now, he's German. Germans aren't exactly Ukraine-friendly, at least when it comes to Ukrainian nationalism. So the fact that he says it's not 2,000, let's say it's 200, is significant, right? Just recently, a Ukrainian scholar by the name of Anatoly Plichko did a very sustained, very detailed analysis of the sources. It was even more detailed than that engaged in by Struve. And he concludes that we can at best say with certainty that maybe 75 Jews were killed. Now, 75, 200 basically is the same ballpark figure. Much, again, too many. And it's a shame and it's a scandal that this occurred. And we should acknowledge that. But at the same time, it's not 2,000. But you look at the literature and no one ever questions that number. Because, of course, it fits that discourse. You see, ironically, the discourse that is supposed to exist amongst Ukrainians doesn't really exist. But the discourse that is claimed not to exist, the one amongst the vilifiers, does in fact exist. There is, in a way, a kind of blueprint of what to do and how to write, whom to criticize and what words to use in order to make a particular vilifying point. Final point. One of the things that just mystifies me is people ask, well, what is the true nature of the Ukrainian nationalist movement? And of course, the true nature of the Ukrainian nationalist movement is self-evident in the name. It should be nationalism, right? I mean, and it is. And I would suggest that we should take the nationalists seriously, whether they're Mazzini, the IRA, the Palestinians, the Jews, or the Ukrainians, or the Vietnamese. When they call themselves nationalists, they say that for a reason, because they are nationalists, which is to say, as Dr. Vytvytskyi pointed out in a number of his citations, that they support independent statehood for their nations. That is fundamentally the core of nationalism. And the Ukrainians were no different from the Jews or the Palestinians or the Irish or the Vietnamese or the Algerians or the Italians or the Germans or the Poles and so on. If you look at the record of the Polish party, Polska Partia Socjalistyczna, the Polish Socialist Party, before World War I, they committed something like 250 assassinations. They robbed banks and post offices. Compared to the Polish nationalist movement headed by none other than Józef Piłsudski, the future dictator and president, right, of Poland, the hero whose statue stands in central Warsaw, the Ukrainian nationalists were little boys and girls. I once calculated that they killed something like 40 or 50 people in the course of 20 years. These guys did 250. Again, I don't know if that's good or bad. That's for you to decide. My point is, if you're going to vilify one, well, we may as well vilify all of them. Nationalists do good things, like fight for their sovereignty and so on, but they often employ violence. That's in the nature of the beast. When you're challenging an existing state, even more so when you're challenging an existing international system, such as Ukrainians were challenging, you will meet with the violence of that state. And good or bad, right or wrong, Christian or non-Christian, I'm not making a moral judgment here, the tendency amongst nationalists, and indeed amongst peoples, look at Ukraine today, is to respond to violence with violence. That's a sad fact, and we'd prefer it to be otherwise, but it happens to be the truth. Final point about nationalism. Nationalists are often violent, that's true, but again, it's not because they are innately violent beasts. They just use these means in order to achieve their ends, given the complexity of the situation, right? But what is striking about nationalism, the doctrine, the ideology of aligning a nation with its own independent state, is that it is compatible with just about any kind of regime. There are communist nationalists, there are Muslim nationalists, there are Catholic nationalists, there are Protestant nationalists, there are fascist nationalists, there are liberal nationalists, there are democratic nationalists. And when you look at the Ukrainian experience, the Ukrainian nationalist experience, you look at them in the 1920s, they were by and large non-democratic, more or less anti-democratic, but not quite authoritarian. In the 1930s, they become more explicitly authoritarian. Late 30s, I'm not sure I'd call them fascist even then, but let's, for the sake of argument, say that for 2 years they flirted with fascism. 1943, they suddenly adopt a democratic socialist program. And they retain that until 1955, when the entire movement is eliminated in Ukraine. Vilifiers often refer to this as opportunism. No, they were doing what all nationalists do. right? There is no one regime type that is that has to go with an independent state. You can have a democratic independent state, and you can have a totalitarian independent state. It all depends on the volition of the nationalists and the people. And the Ukrainian nationalists, in their ideological evolution, right, essentially exhibited precisely that point, okay? I'll end on that, except to suggest to you that there is a book that just came out, edited by Serhiy Yakelchik, called Ireland and Ukraine. I've just begun reading it, so I can't say that it's a great book or not a great book, but the mere fact that he, and a whole slew of authors, there are about 30 authors, that they are comparing Ukraine with Ireland, and not with Nazi Germany, and not with fascist Italy, is already an important step forward. I would like to see a comparison of the Ukrainian nationalist movement with the black civil rights movement in this country. And that would really be something. Дякую вам за вашу увагу.
Well, those were two great presentations, and we're running out of time. So what I'm going to do is keep it very short. Essentially, I'm just going to make a few comments to these two wonderful presentations. First of all, in Ukraine today, everything is being fused into one narrative, a narrative of national liberation struggle. And there's a lot to be said for that. From the time of the revolution, 1917 to 1920, through the 1920s, the Ukrainianization policy, the struggle against Stalin, the Second World War, right through the dissident movements of the present day. There is a drive for national liberation. We can agree with that. But can we fold all of these movements, all of these groups, into the same fold? Does the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, differ? I want to look at three controversial issues. They've been looked at a little bit in these talks, but these are the issues that come up most often when the OUN is mentioned. The OUN in the 30s was roundly criticized by Ukrainian society, by Democrats, by parliamentarians, by the church, by community leaders for its assassination, and not only of Poles, Soviet officials, but also of Ukrainians, for its robberies, for its cult of violence. And as Shevchenko and other, Metropolitan Shevchenko and others said, they were turning youth into gangsters. One has to bear in mind the fact that they were a minority, 8,000 or 9,000 people prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. Now, I realize that in the Russian imperial narrative, everybody is a fascist. Everybody who opposes Moscow rule was called a bourgeois nationalist or a fascist or now a neo-Nazi. But the OUN incorporated the word nationalism into its title, into its name, and its ideology did differ. How did it differ? Well, first of all, they were programmatically extreme right, what we would call today extreme right, meaning they were anti-democratic, anti-parliamentary, anti-liberal, pro-dictatorship. They threw the word demo-liberal, Democrat and liberal, at others as an insult. Even at the previous generation, the generation of the Czerwona Kolina, the Vytvytskyi, the people who fought for independence 1917 to 1920. True, and I agree with what Professor Motyl said, this ideological choice was made in a context. They considered a national state, winning a national state, as the primary goal, and recognized that you had to have an army, you had to have a military. There would be a military struggle. But at the same time, they did, in their program, the first item on their program said they were for a totalitarian state. So that becomes part of the ideology. And when, just before the Second World War, they moved into a different kind of sphere. They became pro-German in many respects, pro-dictatorship for sure. They supported various dictators in Europe, but also they became more anti-Semitic in their propaganda. To the best of my knowledge, neither wing of the OUN said anything about the murder of Jews prior, during, or after the Second World War. Now you can debate whether whether ideology is really that important. Many people joined the OUN not for ideological reasons, but simply because they wanted to fight the Soviets or the Poles. And also you can say that within the OUN, as I found out when I wrote my book on Ukrainian nationalism, there was an internal debate. And many people at the top said, why are we writing this in our propaganda? What are we talking about when we speak about getting rid of the Jews or moving the Jews out? Who needs this? So ideology is very often used against the OUN, but people don't go deeply into understanding the tensions within and the discussions within the OUN about that ideology. Then there is political alignment. The OUN moved, as has been said, towards a pro-German approach. And of course, they hoped that the Germans would allow them to create a state. There were two small battalions created, Nachtigall and Roland, 300 people approximately each. They were removed after 4 weeks because of insubordination. But that has been used against the OUN as an example of their pro-German views. Also, we know that when the Germans invaded in 1941, there were arches set up welcoming the Germans with portraits of Bandera and Hitler. And this becomes the compromising material that is used to show pro-German, pro-Nazi, pro-fascist views. Then there is the military action, or the politics of violence. Already we've heard about 1941. We've heard about the Volyn massacres of 1943, but also the killing of other nationalists, primarily members of the OUNM, the Melnik faction, which is well documented. I mean, they were killing off competitors because the idea was to create a one-party state. As for the Volyn massacres, leading historians have now said that this was not only a huge mistake, but it was a terrible event. Ihor Ilyushin, Myroslaw Herzak, Yaroslav Dashkevich, and even Volodymyr Vytrovich agree that a decision was taken to ethnically cleanse the Poles. So when we look back on this history, we have to live with these facts. We have to live with this ugly side of the history. I agree entirely that there was a change after 1943. The organization, OUN, dominated UPA, came to a different program, an anti-totalitarian program, and a program with a pro-Western orientation. and it tried to create a governing structure, the UHVR, Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council, which was organized in 1944 as a kind of a government in the underground. I think that change was genuine, and we see, as has been said, from the writings of Petro Poltava, from Osip Hornovy, from the memoirs of Lev Shankovsky, who pointed out in his Pochidni Gruppe OUN, that the OUN propagandists learned when they came to eastern and central Ukraine, there was strong resistance from the people to any talk of totalitarianism and to any talk of a Ukrainian Führer. We also have to recall that in 1943 it became clear to many people that Germany was losing the war, so a change of orientation occurred. But the next phase of the struggle, 1944 to 1947, mainly in the Zakarzonia, the lands along the Kherson line, separating Poland and Ukraine, contemporary Poland and Ukraine, that was in many ways a heroic struggle. The remnants of the UPA joined with locals who were resisting massive deportation to Ukraine and to the northern and western parts of Poland. And the local people joined with the UPA fighters in a very strong struggle that lasted for 2 years, 3 years, until pretty much all of those communities were gotten rid of, were deported. The ideology then became not only, it was double-voiced, it was a dual ideology. From the UPA, it was independent Ukraine, we are for an independent Ukraine, but from the locals it was resistance to deportation. They didn't want to be thrown off their ancestral lands. Now that last phase has frequently been remembered in post-war literature, art, memoirs, in emigration, and now in Ukraine as heroic. A heroic but doomed struggle. So today, when we talk about this pantheon, creating a pantheon of national heroes, which is what Ukraine is doing, because it's in a struggle, it needs military heroes, it needs the image of strong fighters, we have to decide who goes into that pantheon. Who are the icons, who are the portraits, who are the people? And we also have to get a better understanding of the history. Sometimes that means distancing oneself from aspects of that history. I'll just use one example. Dmytro Dontsov was an admirer of Hitler, Mussolini, and interwar dictators. He was a racist, a fascist, a politically loose cannon. Even the OUN leadership could not stand him. He refused to join any party, but he worked during the German occupation for Reinhard Heydrich's Institute in Prague, published a book, a very racist commentary called Duch Nashei Davniny, in which he divided Ukrainians into 4 racial types: Nordic, Mediterranean, Dinaric, Oriental, Ostiyska rasa. Even leaders of the OUN broke with him. Major writers like Leonid Mosenz, who idolized him in the 30s, broke with him. So did Yuri Kleno Burkhardt, so did Ulas Samchuk, Yuri Lipa. All these are major so-called nationalist writers from the 30s. They all distanced themselves from Dontsov. So my question is, why does a person like Serhiy Kvit idolize Dontsov? Why is he trying to portray him as a liberal, a democrat, a great figure to be emulated? I think that attitude to the uncritical attitude to the creation of a pantheon has to change. As has been said, Ukrainian history in the 30s and 40s is very complicated. It's multifaceted. It's also fascinating. It has much to teach: post-colonial studies, decolonization, which is now popular, national liberation. But only if the lessons learned are done through honest and careful examination of sources. we need a serious work of understanding, and that's, I think, on the agenda. I have to stop there because I'm sure you have things to ask, things to say. So please feel free to join the conversation.
Будь ласка, чи є запитання? Are there any questions from the audience? Either in English або по-українськи, як хочете, as you like. Volodymyr.
Yeah, I was about to do it in UK. Я думав взяти в українській мові, тому що ще не приїхав з України. І ми навіть мали таку дискусію над тим, що ви перед ними дискутували. But I'm going to do it in English because I'm doing reference to some of the stuff that I personally was involved with. Some of the work that I did with Cossack, material the Cossack sent me on Ukraine in the Third Reich. Apparently, something that did appear not only in Ukrainian but appeared in English with real documents. We used it at a conference we just did about a month ago or 2 months ago. Interesting, the reference here we were talking about Kherson and nationalism and our boys working in Kherson and the Russian occupation, and here we had material from OUN being chased around Kherson in 42, not 43, 42, in Kherson. It turns out that Stefan Bandera phones me and says, well, that was my uncle, Bohdan Bandera, that was down there. So what's interesting is context. I realize that in some ways it's absolutely right. And when it comes to Dontsov, Dr. Shkandrij, I have a tendency to agree that, and a lot of us have a tendency to agree with that. But when it comes to the confession about 38 to 41, we have to be very careful. John Burrell actually taught me that when he basically said that 1941, when we did what we did, and we did it early, and confronted the Germans, and then all got arrested, we turned out to be the only nation that didn't really have. I mean, the French had Pétain. The Norwegians, God love all of them, but they had Quisling. The folks next door had, in Slovakia, had Tisza. But we actually ended up not having a collaborationist government. That's interesting. Hunchak then picks up on that, and Hunchak, along with a very good friend of mine from the Cold War period, and I will enter the Cold War period, Romerstein, who wrote a very important article that dealt with this, pointed out to 3 things that are very important to this discussion. One, in Nuremberg, if in fact OUN, for that matter, if Divizia, and Lechuk makes that point all the time, if OUN or Divizia were in fact as collaborationists as everybody says they are, and use monuments and all this damage that's being done, then that would have been brought up in Nuremberg. Because at that time, the Soviets were really strong and insistent on what they were doing. Instead, Romerstein had the theory that as a result of the 70s, and he wrote this, I was not a co-author, but I certainly did a lot of work with him on this. He wrote that it's in the 70s and 80s, when the Soviets were really scared of the possibility of the Jewish refuseniks and the Ukrainian nationalists finding a road, that you suddenly have this burst of energy, enormous burst of energy and a lot of material that suddenly appears. And so that's interesting because a character called Gomordsky has just picked up on that and picked up on a lot of what Romerstein wrote in his article. One of the points that, Alexander, you talked about, whether it's 2,000, all of that, even if it was 20, that was very bad news. And we should bitch that there was a pogrom. But the one thing that Romerstein made it clear, he made it clear that at no point did any of the organizations, any of the factions of OUN call, at that point, officially call for pogrom. There was none with this when it comes to the Lvivsky. That's one thing he made confirmed. Second, he said, when it comes to Nakhtagad and Royan, very interesting, he says, Canaris is now nearly, and Gomordsky has actually gone further than Romerstein. He says, it's interesting that if, in fact, Nakhtagad and Royan was created by Canaris and by Oberländer. And it turns out, and this is where we have to, even as historians, you have to take that responsibility. We're scared of that third rail about talking about German factions, that there was an Abwehr faction that was really actually relatively anti-Nazi. They were anti-Russian, because it was Russia versus Germany, but they were also anti-Nazi. And those characters, who now have been glorified in movies, you know, the Canaris group, you see the movie with Tom Cruise and so on and so forth, Valkyrie and so on, have been glorified as attempting to assassinate. And we're hearing even that the Canaris people, men at the end of the war, gave all the information about rocketry, and yet they have now been unsanctioned. Oberländer has been unsanctioned, and yet Shkandrij ended up being sanctioned. It also turns out that in that same Gomurski article, very recently written, he says that thing that they used, that he went to Belarus with a Karayna battalion, it turns out it wasn't, and it turns out that he ran away from it, and it turns out that there's now a document that old Gomurski, printed in Times of Israel, shows that Shkandrij ended up on a most wanted list of SDAT, and at a relatively early period of time, 42, 43. So to make a long story short, the very fact, and Chandler brought this up to me because his father was foreign minister in the Karpatsko Ukraine, as early as 39, we knew, and guys like Shkandrij who fought there knew that Horthy, and I was about to think of Orban now, but Horthy was an anti-fascist. Was a fascist. It was their version of fascism, and he sided with Germany, and Germany backed him in Karpatsko Ukraine. To what extent would have Shkandrij then suddenly, and Stichko, the youngsters, have been pro-German? If anything, they might have been situational, but to be really ideologically firm with them is another question. So I'm really sorry that I took as much time as I did, but I've actually written stuff about when Hunchak, his wonderful essays about this have raised this. I've worked with Romerstein on his articles, and so I know that in some ways, those things, including the touchy stuff of were they good Germans? Nobody can say there were ever any good Germans, but there was a difference between the Everniki and the Nazi Party, which was as racist as all hell and stuff like that, and literally thought that we needed third-grade educations or fourth-grade education. So sorry about taking so much time, but I thought that this part also ought to be brought. Okay?
I just mentioned that the reason why Nachtigall and Roland were kept secret was because they knew that Hitler had stated
Thank you.
no Ukrainians should carry arms. There should be no Ukrainian forces. So Canaris did this quietly, in secret, outside the knowledge of the High Command.
And so our difficulty, thank you for making that point, because the difficulty with us is if we mention in public that there might be, oh Jesus, there might have been Germans that were not quite Nazi and stuff like that, or were less Nazi and stuff like that, then you get into this, Jesus Christ, you've touched the third rail. There were no good Germans. So in effect, man, that we face that as well. I mean, so
I just wanted to make a brief comment. If you look comparatively, every country, whether it has a state or whether it doesn't have a state, has moderates and radicals.
Yes.
And the moderates always criticize the radicals, and the radicals always criticize the moderates. And especially, and then if you look within the radical movements, whether they're communist or nationalist or fascist or whatever, there too, there are always radicals and moderates. So I would just bring to your attention, the PLO under Arafat was moderate.
Yes.
The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was radical. What happened between the two groups? The PLO killed the PFLP, and the PFLP killed PLO. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Algeria, Front de Libération, whatever the name was, there were camps set up for Algerian refugees in Paris, near Paris. And this is during the war. The FLN infiltrated the camps and killed its opponents.
Yes.
who were generally the moderates. The same is true of the IRA. There are the moderates, and of course they're still killing each other, aren't they? Now this is all very unfortunate, and we may criticize it, but it happens to be the way these things work, both within the larger society and then within the nationalist movements within. You always have these sorts of issues, and they almost always end up in some form of violence. So the OUN is really, the extraordinary thing about the OUN is that it is extremely ordinary. It is really exactly like every other nationalist movement I could think of. I think we can take one more question, останнє питання, and then I think we need to break. Так, будь ласка.
I have heavy accent in English. Can I speak
Так,
in
так, будь ласка,
Ukrainian?
українською.
Отже, я відносилася до правозахисного руху в 60-х-80-х років. І що я хочу сказати і натиснути на це, що робила пропаганда не тільки в жовтні, а в кожній газеті було Бандера і Шептицький. Шептицький і Бандера. Це у всіх газетах. Воно так як било, як молотком по голові. Окрім того, я в правозахисному русі займалася своєю спеціальністю нищення пам'яток історії і культури. Ніхто не говорить про це. Є пейзаж Івана Труша. За його будинком Штрека і було жидівський цвинтар. Зруйнували його в 53-52 році. Щось таке. Я тоді була дуже мала. Я недалеко мешкала, і ми з дочкою Труша були в контакті. Про те, що Шептицький захистив енну кількість жидівських дітей, я не знаю скільки. Я це довідалася від свого вихователя, отця Клюса, який фінансовою стороною при Шептицькому віддав. Він їх захистив, і про це ніхто не говорить. Ну, дуже мало, скажімо. Це просто і на це треба натискати. Остання синагога у Львові, яка була знищена, це в 53-му році, вона знаходилася на Лівандівці. Це радянський період. Бо я ранішого періоду, крім того, що я приятелювала з Галиною Захарясевич-Липою, якого вбили після того, як він кесарів розтин прийняв дитині. То про це також дуже мало говорять. Я про це знала, довідалася від Галини Захарясевич-Липи. І Марта Скорупська редагувала про Юрія Липу книжки, і вона з моїх слів про це написала. На подвір'ю зразу, як він кесарів розтин зробив жінці, його розстріляли на подвір'ї. Про це дуже мало говорять. А я про це натискаю то, що я знаю напевне завжди. І про нищення пам'яток також. Я маю на увазі не тільки, я всі пам'ятки, які нищилися, захищала. Це не має значення. Тепер, наприклад, в Криму нищили і візантійську культуру, бо там багато греків було, і мусульманські. Практично майже все знищили. Я про це довідалася.
Дякую дуже. Останнє слово просив, що доктор Vytvytskyi, і ми тоді we'll end the evening with Dr. Vytvytskyi's comments. Дякуємо дуже.
Thank you. Very, very briefly. First of all, if any of you are seriously interested in the whole question of Ukrainian nationalism, I would urge you, and I don't get a commission on this, I would urge you to buy and read Myroslaw Shkandrij's really outstanding book on Ukrainian nationalism. Came out, about 10 years ago? Yale University Press. Again, it's extremely interesting and enlightening and illuminating. A quick point about Dontsov. I think everybody has a hard time learning to differentiate. I once asked, I grew up with a number of people who had been in the underground movement, and I remember asking one of them, because I had by accident stumbled across Dontsov when I was 17. I didn't know who he was, I didn't understand who he was, but he struck me as kind of a crazy guy. So then later on my parents explained to me who he was. My parents were not charitable in their explanation. And so then I asked one of my uncles with whom I had many conversations. He was a close associate of Lebed's. What was the attraction of Dontsov? And my uncle explained that back in the 20s and early 30s, Ukrainians felt themselves to be stuck. Okay, I use the metaphor of the two deep holes. There are other ways of describing it. They were at a dead end. Nobody gave two hoots about them. They were getting massacred. They were having all kinds of other things happen. They had the Holodomor, et cetera, et cetera. And here was a guy who had a lot of bravado and pretended to be able to spout philosophy, which ultimately, most of which was nonsense. But this was a guy who seemed to offer a way out. And that was the major attraction. People didn't really understand the pseudo-philosophy that he was trying to import, where he was borrowing from various actual philosophers, and so on and so forth. What people were responding to, according to this uncle of mine, was people were responding to the opportunity to find a way out, whatever its contradictions, et cetera, et cetera. And again, as I mentioned in my talk, in the Erlacher book, which does a very good job with my only reservation is the way he describes the OUN. He kind of adopts uncritically the vilifier's view. But his account of Dontsov is very, very good. And he shows that with respect to certain things, Dontsov was right on back in the 20s and early 30s, i.e. he was absolutely right on about the nature of Russian imperialism and the messianism and the lunacy of Russian imperialism. And he was right on. He was one of the earliest people who said that Ukrainians and Poles have to find rapprochement, which at that point was viewed as heresy. Later on, Dontsov, as Professor Shkandrij said, went off the rails in numerous ways, but that's another story. Last point, context, context, context. The world changed in very substantial ways after World War II. In some sense, the Western world was chastened by World War II, by the Holocaust, and the Western world became much more morality-oriented after World War II. And it was not that way at all prior to World War II. So, for example, the vilifiers complained that the OUN chaps were anti-democratic. Well, the problem was that the so-called democratic world was not exactly something that you would want to sign up to. I mean, after all, Britain was a colonial power. OUN was aware of the IRA's struggle against Britain for purposes of Irish independence. France was a major colonial power. The United States, to our shame, was a racist country. I mean, the Germans copied some of our racist laws for their purposes. So it's not as though we the West, were a paragon of virtue or whatever else. People who have been raised in the current post-World War II environment seem not to have any sense of what things were like prior to World War II, period.
Okay, thank you. I would like to say thanks to our speakers and to your presence. Please follow our announcement on Society's website and Facebook. Reception will be on the third floor. Thank you.